had to turn down the sound so we wouldn't get any feedback. This is Arizona Springtime, Memoir of a Journey. We will continue with Chapter 14. This is Part 2 of a life-changing hike into the Grand Canyon. To access Part 1, go to my channel at, Seldom Seen Southwest on YouTube. Okay, we'll go ahead and begin. This is Part 2. Before sunrise, everybody woke to the reality of the cold. It had dropped to 15 degrees. Being residents of the Phoenix area, most of us were wholly unprepared. Everyone suffered through the night. I sat up and looked around. Nearby was a picnic table covered with detritus from someone's backpack, including a loaf of bread that froze during the night. On the ground under a bench were a pair of shoes, and leaning against the table were backpacks. Somebody had taken the time to put up a pup tent, but it was ineffective against the cold. The rest of us had just slept on the frozen ground. Everyone began to look around for sticks to build a campfire. Our site was among many campsites, most occupied by enclosed campers. Sticks were sparse, and the campfire, once started, was only the size of a dinner plate. After we learned that wood could not be collected for fires, the fire was fed with individual sheets of toilet paper that someone had brought. We stood stomping and clapping around the measly fire and talked about the cold. Bruce, meanwhile, left to go pay for our entrance fee and to pick up the backcountry permit. At that point, Audrey had taken out her only warm clothing, a sweater, from her backpack. I was still wearing my work clothes, and I knew I had thrown plenty of clothes in the trunk of my car. I offered them to her. She asked, "Are you sure?" Soon we're at the trunk of the car, and as the others were huddled around a minuscule fire, I suggested, after handing her some clothes, that we get in the car and turn on the heat. She agreed immediately, with no compunction towards toughing it out. We would wait for Bruce in the warm car no matter how long it took. While the others remained huddled and hunched at the campfire, we enjoyed the car's fountain of warm air. Our breakfast consisted of granola bars and trail mix, served from plastic baggies. Bruce returned with the backcountry permit, and we were ready to go into the canyon. My car was left at Bright Angel Lodge, and the Thunderbird was used to shuttle us to Yaki Point, and the trailhead for the South Kaibab Trail, 7,200 feet in elevation. The hike would cover just over 16 miles and end at Bright Angel Trailhead the next day. Many of the geological wonders of the canyon were named by Francois Mathis, a topographical map maker who, in 1902, mapped the canyon. He named many of the geological prominences for southwestern Native American peoples. He named Yaki Point, spelled Y-A-K-I, for the Yaki people, spelled Y-A-Q-U-I. He also is the originator of Mescalero Point, Hopi Point, Membrano Point, Mojave Point, Papago Point, Paiute Point, Pima Point, Toltec Point, a people never proven to live in the Southwest, Yavapai Point, and Zuni Point. As a group, the excitement level began to build while we posed for several group photographs. Audrey wore my well-fitted jeans with the hem rolled up, LL Bean hiking boots, and carried a backpack that had been checked out from the Community Outing Club supplies. She also wore a dusty red heavy wool sweater that she had knitted herself. I wore jeans, a jean jacket, and 2 shirts, a holdover from the Chicago winters. I also wore a red beanie to keep my head from freezing. I also wore heavy-soled hiking boots. The others wore sneakers, caps, and jeans. One moment I breathed in the soft aroma of evergreens at the rim, and that was replaced with a rock and ice aromatic tang as I stepped off onto the trail. Within the first few steps of the ice and snow-covered trail, I knew what it felt to be an explorer. I knew how Buzz Aldrin felt when, after a few inane comments after stepping on the surface of the moon, he became the explorer. He marveled poetically at the magnificent desolation before him. I knew how the first deep sea divers felt as they first stepped on the bottom of the sea. I felt equal to those moments. I knew they would have taken a deep breath like I had, and their senses would become heightened. Each new moment in a new land became a new reality. The trail continued below the rim, and as we arrived at Cedar Ridge, a mule train passed us on their way up to the rim. Mules have priority on the trail, and Audrey and I stood trailside away from the edge as they passed. The train was led by a cowboy riding tall on his mule. Half the mules were fitted with packs, the others carried riders who were dressed for the cold weather at the rim. Past O'Neill Butte at 5,800 feet were a series of switchbacks. My landscape, or wide view photographs from the top of the switchbacks, were similar to the ones taken at the bottom. Visually, the landscape changed every moment. Unencumbered with clouds, the deep blue sky of the arid lands was familiar, but the shadows playing across the vast landscape were new and exciting. Farther from me, as distance grew, the shadows became bluer over the layers of the canyon. I hiked through a new landscape menagerie as one visual exploration was replaced by another. The sweet odor of sagebrush replaced the musty rock smell. Breezes began to warm as the day and elevation changed. There was little chatter as we hiked. I listened to the patient crunch of small rocks beneath my boots. Then an unfamiliar sound began to grow. In the distance, echoes of the roaring Colorado River vibrated across the parched land. After we arrived at the Tonto plateau, roughly 4,000 feet in elevation, we came to Tipoff. A convenient toilet and an emergency phone were placed off-trail. The crowded South Kaibab trail needed the welcome way station. We are now over 3,000 feet lower than the rim. The day had warmed enough that Audrey changed from my heavy jeans to her khaki shorts. The change in temperature was a surprise for me. I had not realized or thought about the change in altitude. I had reasoned that the canyon was part of northern Arizona, a place well known to be cold even during late spring. My naivete and perspective was altered by my lack of experience. I wish I had brought shorts. Soon after tip-off, the trail hugged carved-out cliff faces and began to drop gradually into the darkened granite gorge. There was no visual sign of the Colorado River till we arrived at Panorama Point. Well named, the steep-sided jut of rock offered the first real close-up view of the Colorado River roiling below. The river flowed over white-capped rapids. On the far side of the river, a stunning, towering cliff face rose thousands of feet into the sky above. I could only shake my head in wonder, then document the moment with a photograph. Although the river looked close, we were still 2 miles from trail's end at Bright Angel Creek. Audrey could feel that we were close to our destination, and as the trail angled downward precipitously, she had a second wind. I walked a tightrope between sleep deprivation and the sense of wonder I was experiencing. For me, there was no second wind until we approached the end of the trail much later. After we walked over the Colorado River, across Kaibab Bridge, an iron suspension bridge held perilously by thick metal cables and iron handholds, the floor of wood planks was wide enough for 2 people to pass. We came to ancestral Pueblo ruins, only feet away from the swift river. Those ruins had been discovered by John Wesley Powell, the leader of the first explorers to travel through the entire canyon by boat. The small ruins appeared to me exactly as they did from Powell's description about 115 years before. The same, at the time of discovery, he observed, quote, "Late in the afternoon I return and go up a little gulch just above this creek, about 200 feet from camp, and discover the ruins of 2 or 3 old houses which were originally of stone laid in mortar. Only the foundations are left, but irregular blocks of which the houses were constructed lie scattered about. In one room I find an old mealing stone, deeply worn, as if it had been much used. A great deal of pottery is strewn about." End quote. The ruins remained the same except for the pottery. There were 3 squared rooms. A circular ruin with a foundation below ground level was offset from the other rooms. It was lined with slightly worn river rocks to ground level. Someone, maybe an explorer in more recent times, used some of the rocks strewn around the ruins to build a fire pit. Those rocks were still blackened. Nearby was Bright Angel Creek, a clear, sprightly stream that originated toward the north and entered the Colorado near the campground. Powell himself named the creek. Quote, "We have named one stream way above in honor of the great chief of the Bad Angels. And as this is in beautiful contrast to that, we conclude to name it Bright Angel." End quote. Upon completion of the first day of hiking, 6.9 miles, we arrived at the shore of the Colorado River, a thick shake of flowing brown water. During the winter of 1982-83, snowpack in the Rockies was 3 times greater than normal. Downriver, Glen Canyon Dam held back the great river to form Lake Powell, and the Bureau of Reclamation kept Lake Powell near full capacity. In July 1983, the massive snowmelt forced the Bureau to release an unprecedented amount of water below the dam. The release of water is close to the bottom of the dam. The lake bottom water is very cold. When we saw the great river, it was flowing about 3 feet higher than normal, running roughly at 97,300 cubic feet per second. The normal rate of flow is 17,660 CFS. The greatest flood on record at the canyon was in 1862. Water flowed at 500,000 CFS down the then wild river. We set up camp at Bright Angel Campground about 4 p.m. Audrey had thoughtfully brought ramen noodles for her lunch and put on a pot over the butane burner. For me, breakfast, lunch, and dinner consisted of the same trail mix. Following the late lunch, I needed other sustenance, and the 2 of us decided to walk to Phantom Ranch for a beer. I was still duded up in my jean jacket and jeans, and Audrey was stylish in her green Ralph Lauren polo and pale khaki knee-length shorts. She finished off her wardrobe by changing out her hiking boots for a pair of Bass sandals and put on a cool pair of aviator sunglasses. The remote Phantom Ranch was originally conceived and built by canyon pioneer David Rust. The perseverance of the pioneers is often underappreciated, especially when the historical record cannot fully realize the engineering needed to transport the materials over a newly blazed trail. In 1903, he christened the new tourist destination as Rust's. 4 years later, as a further convenience for guests, a tramway was built across the Colorado. After Teddy Roosevelt was a guest, it was popularly renamed Roosevelt's Camp. Architect Mary Jane Coulter built the current resort for the Fred Harvey Company. It served tourists that arrived via muleback. Colin Fletcher, during his epic walk through the Grand Canyon, included an extended stop at Phantom Ranch. Throughout the trek, he had not encountered any sign of human interference until the day before he arrived at the resort. Upon realization that the hand of man had reached deep into the canyon, Fletcher looked up at the rim and knew there were paved roads near the stark outcroppings. Inside the cars that drove along the roads were tourists that would eventually stop to look upon the canyon. Some of those tourists had, quote, in their minds exploded beyond old boundaries, end quote, while others glanced at the view, then, quote, checked their watches to see if the hotel had begun to serve lunch yet, end quote. During his groundbreaking sojourn, he walked sans clothing except for hat and footwear. As he approached the ranch, he resented having to put on the clothes. After crossing the bridge, he admitted that he fell into the familiar social and practical comforts that the ranch offered. His primitive eating style on the trail was replaced by tables, chairs, and plates of food. He casually began to talk to the interested tourists. He remained at Phantom Ranch for a week and knew that he was lured into the world of humans again. He also knew that those who were at the ranch saw it as quiet and secluded, like a sanctuary. But the ranch had a telephone, mail service, other people to talk to, food that was very fresh, electricity, and incredibly enough a swimming pool. During his stay at the ranch, he did not feel like he was in the canyon. The ranch life was so constrained, he did not believe he was in a wilderness. Following his side trip, he continued his trek. After a few days of hiking, he began to ask himself questions that only a long-distance hiker needed to think about. Questions such as, how far is it to the next water? Will my water last? Am I running low on anything? How many hours to the next drop site? When we arrived at the ranch, there was a bare little room staffed with dedicated servers ready to serve tourists that had arrived on incoming mule trains and reservations for an overnight stay at the ranch. Hikers were treated as a second-class citizen. After we enjoyed ice-cold beer, we were no longer welcomed and were promptly evicted. After the beer, we walked along the shallow, free-flowing Bright Angel Creek. I commented to Audrey that I wanted to walk down to the Colorado River. Once there, we celebrated the hike by sticking our tired and hurt feet into the Colorado River. Off came boots and socks, and we stuck our feet into the shockingly cold river water. Yet it felt so good we welcomed the moment. Although the river was running higher than normal, the sound from the rushing water could not drown out our conversation. It was beautiful there along the river, seated on large rocks surrounded by a small bit of beach. To deepen the moment, we shared our perspectives of nature and realized that this experience was special, and we absorbed the moment. We had been acquaintances up until we had sat down at the river. Now we remember that time as the first moments we began to enjoy each other, and we celebrate that to this day. We spent a long time amid the ancient dense black rock of the Vishnu schist. We remained there until the tall cliffs of the inner gorge forced an early twilight. That night I slept in the pup tent. After it began to rain, condensation formed on the roof of the tent and droplets fell onto my face and head. I had another sleepless night. The next morning, others in the hiking party jettisoned unnecessary equipment for the long, steep climb back up to the south rim. They knew they would be weighed down by superfluous material such as a large can of Dinty-Moore stew. For the second day of hiking, Audrey was dressed in my jeans, a gray Everlast romper, and a folded bandana around her head. The night cooled the bottom of the canyon, but it was still warm. That would change during the hike back to the rim. We had 9.3 miles ahead and 4,360 feet in elevation to conquer. Our calves and leg muscles would complain during the workout. Misty rain fell as we began to climb out of the canyon via Bright Angel Trail. At times the clouds parted to bring momentary sunlight upon a patch of distant land. Then the intricate canyons and promontories revealed new colors. The light and shadows had a dramatic interplay, like yin-yang. Large sections of the canyon were lightened in the distance, and as the clouds moved overhead, those sections would disappear into shadow, and just as suddenly we would be paved in the warm sunlight again. We arrived at Pipe Creek, a narrow stream, and crossed to the far side over uneven rocks with our ungainly backpacks. My leg muscles complained but compensated. An exquisite ribbon waterfall flowed into the creek. The thread of white water was outlined with freshly soaked mosses. Spring wildflowers grew trailside through the lower elevations of the canyon. Then the sky darkened, and we stopped to look up to the south rim far above. A thick mist of falling and swirling snow obscured our view. The snow level had already begun to drop lower into the canyon. Audrey and I were partners during the return hike. We crossed and recrossed Garden Creek, lined with stands of young cottonwoods vying for space at the edge of the creek. At one crossing, we looked up canyon and saw a profusion of impressionistic pink-red. The western redbud trees were blooming. We walked through the wonderland of redbuds while keeping an eye on the snowy mist still far above us. Still nominally in charge, Bruce and one or two of the others were ahead of us on the trail. They took a side excursion to Plateau Point for a final view of the river from the steep 1,300-foot cliff. I knew I didn't have enough reserve energy and time, so we skipped the view and continued on to Indian Garden. The temperature had cooled enough that we added another layer of clothing. Just up the trail from Indian Garden, we watched a small herd of mule deer. One deer still had spots of a fawn along its neck. They were grazing off trail, but remained unconcerned even though we came upon them suddenly. The deer were cautious, and we were curious. We remained there until the deer drifted further into the thick brush and left us to continue our lives. We entered the steep switchbacks, and the temperature became noticeably cooler with every turn. Our hands were exposed, but the backpacks made it difficult to tuck them into a pocket. We decided to stop and cover our hands with yesterday's socks to act as mittens. The steep trail became slippery from mule piss puddles lined with their droppings. To keep from falling, we held on to each other's hands. As we entered the snow zone in the final series of switchbacks, Bruce passed us going down. He explained to us that another hiker told him that a couple he invited on the trip were having a hard time hiking up to the rim and had abandoned their backpacks along the trail. He was going back down to retrieve the backpacks and help them up to the trailhead. As we neared trail's end, the snow thickened and fierce, chilly blast of wind pummeled us as we turned to climb each switchback. We were encouraged by our knowledge that the rim was close, even though it was completely fogged by swirling snow. The end of the hike meant the end of the explorer feeling. As Buzz Aldrin left the surface of the moon to enter the lunar module for the last time, or the deep sea diver returned to the boat, there is a sense of leaving a special place and returning to the familiar. We arrived at Bright Angel Trailhead, worn but otherwise satisfied that we had finished the trek. We stopped to drop off our backpacks at my car, and then went to Bright Angel Lodge. The cozy interior had a warm and inviting restaurant with attached bar. We must have looked like hikers because tourists passed us and asked if we had hiked the canyon. We smiled and answered yes. At the hotel bar, Audrey ordered a double Hennessy and bought a round for anyone else at the bar to celebrate the end of the hike and our accomplishment. I ordered a hot chocolate because even after 2 sleepless nights, I was still expected to man the steering wheel for the drive home. After sitting a while, we went to the brightly lit hotel gift shop to browse for a commemorative souvenir. We bought canyon-themed t-shirts. A wall of windows looked out upon the snow falling on the rim, and we watched for returning hikers, but gave up and went back to the restaurant. We were there a long time before the final hikers surfaced from the depths. The stragglers were not able to relax at the restaurant because we were determined to begin the drive home. We jumped up to get to the cars. After we exited Flagstaff, Audrey and Bruce drifted off, and I remained alert by listening to a cassette tape of George Gershwin's Rhapsody in Blue. We arrived deep into the night back at the University B parking lot. Although the lot was still deserted and had not changed during the 2 days, our worlds had changed. So ends the chapter. See you in the next one.